The Lord be with you. Jesus calls us to take up the cross and follow. Become trusting God's promise. Those who lose their life for Christ's sake will find it. We come to worship, to listen, and to follow. Why? My God, why have you forsaken me? My God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but do not find rest. My God, why have you forsaken me? To you they cried and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. My God, why have you forsaken me? All who see me mock me. They sneer and shake their heads. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Do not be far from me, for trouble is near and there is no one to help. My God, why have you forsaken me? Our Old Testament reading this evening comes from Genesis chapter 17. God said to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall give rise to the nations, kings of peoples, and they shall come from her." Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, "Can a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Can Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight." God said, "No, but your wife Sarah shall bear you a son, and you shall name him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard from you, and I will bless him and make him fruitful and exceedingly numerous. He shall be the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this season next year." And when he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. Our gospel reading this evening comes from Mark's Gospel, chapter 8. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, and he must be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the scribes, and the Pharisees. And he will be killed, and after 3 days will rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will gain it. For what will it be good to profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in glory." That passage from Genesis tells us a story that shifts the center of gravity as they knew it. But God didn't raise his voice. The passage here has chapters that are leading up to it, where the covenant story seems to orbit around men. The promises of the land and the descendants are spoken upon Abraham, and his name is changed. His future is secure in the sweeping star-filled imagery. And then quietly, but unmistakably, God turns and speaks a woman's name. Sarai will now be Sarah. It is not simply this cosmetic change, because in the ancient world, names carry a destiny. To rename something was to reframe its life. And in this moment, God does not speak about Sarah. He speaks to and of her as a bearer of promise for the future, that kings of nations will come through her. She's not an afterthought in this story. She is not a vessel on the margins of someone else's covenant. She's standing at the center of the covenant. The man who has been carrying this promise for years just laughs. The sound isn't cruel, but it is revealing. It is a laughter of disbelief, shaped by his long assumptions that surely the future will unfold along this unexpected path. Surely it will move through what has always been considered strong, established, and reliable. Surely it will not come through a woman whose body has been labeled as barren, whose story has been overshadowed. Yet God insists. God insists that the promise will come through her. And in that instance, something deeper is happening than the announcement unlikely birth, a hierarchy is being unsettled. A pattern that privileges just one voice and one body and one line in the inheritance is being gently but firmly disrupted. God doesn't erase the son that was already born in Ishmael. He too will go on to be blessed. But the covenant refuses to bypass the one long discounted. And without slogans or spectacles, the text reveals a God who refuses to build the future by sidelining women. A God who speaks blessing where culture has spoken limitations. A God who refuses to let the inherited systems define what possibilities are ahead. Then we turn to Mark's gospel and we encounter another spiritual recentering, but this time it's around power itself. Jesus begins to teach that his path will not be one of triumphant conquest. He speaks of rejection by religious and political authorities, and then he speaks of his suffering and death. He speaks of a road that leads not to a visible dominance, but to an apparent defeat. And one of his closest followers, Peter, cannot accept this. The expectation was clear that the Anointed One would restore strength and establish order, that he would overcome the opposition in unmistakable ways. Deliverance would look like victory in the language everyone understood. Force meeting force, and strength answering the threat. But Jesus sharply rejects that vision that Peter has, and he names it as a mindset that is fixed only on human concerns. He calls the crowd not just his inner circle of disciples, and he lays it out in terms of discipleship. That there is self-denial, cross-bearing, and following to come. The cross was not a metaphor for mild inconvenience. It was an instrument to a state of horror. A public display meant to reinforce who exactly was in control, and to take it up was to relinquish the illusion of your own self-preservation through the power of others. But Jesus goes further here. The instinct to save one's life at all cost is not what he's telling us to do. He ultimately is telling us that those who give their life will have life. The drive to secure everything, our status, our safety, our superiority, can hollow out the very soul that we're trying to protect. And conversely, relinquishing the need to dominate and surrendering obsessions for the sake of all the good news of Christ is what opens the true way to life. Now, placed side by side, these two texts speak to one another. In Genesis, God refuses to let the covenant rest solely in male lineage and inherited controls. And in Mark, Jesus refuses to let salvation be defined by a triumphal strength. In both stories, what seems secure is unsettled, and what seems weak is what becomes central. What seems powerful becomes exposed as fragile. And we do not need to look far to recognize how relevant that is in today's world. There are still structures, both intimate and global, that assume authority naturally belongs in certain hands. There are still narratives that treat women's leadership as a surprising display or even secondary to men. There are still patterns that expect the future to be carried forward by those who have always held the reins. And when those patterns are questioned, there is often laughter or resistance or even outrage. And the laughter of Abram in Genesis echoes that very system that cannot imagine a blessing coming through someone that has been underestimated. Likewise, there are still reflexes that equate strength with righteousness when unrest surfaces, when the fear in us arises, and when conflict is simmering. And that instinct is often to respond with visible demonstrations of might and strength to project power and to remind the world who can act decisively, to believe that if we are forceful enough, that we can restore order. But Jesus' teaching in Mark unsettles that reflex. The way of life he describes is not fueled by escalation. It does not rely on crushing your opposition. It does not sanctify displays of overwhelming strength as inherently being faithful. Instead, he speaks a path that risks misunderstanding, a path that may look weak in the eyes of the world, a path that values faithfulness over dominance. And this doesn't mean that we should be ignoring injustices. It doesn't mean that we should be abandoning our responsibilities. It does mean that we should be questioning whether the tools of control can ever produce the peace that we claim to desire. What if the covenant's expansion in Genesis invites us to examine those voices that we minimize? What if the cross in Mark is inviting us to examine how quickly we reach for power to quiet our fears? Abram's laughter reveals how deeply expectations take root in our lives. He simply cannot envision a future unfolding through Sarah because he's been shaped by the story in which her role is secondary to his. Peter's resistance reveals just how deeply that we expect our own deliverance to look like a victory as the world would define it. And in both cases, God and Christ refuse to comply with those expectations. The future will not be secured by clinging to these familiar hierarchies. The kingdom will not be established through coercive strength. These hard truths, especially in seasons of instability, when the world feels volatile, when the headlines are filled with tension as they are today and displays of force, it's tempting for us to trust in a visible power. It feels concrete and immediate. It feels reassuring. But the gospel story insists that the most decisive act of God did not come through overwhelming might. It came through vulnerability. It came through self-giving love, through a willingness to endure suffering rather than inflict it on others. The covenant with Sarah reminds us that blessing grows when those long marginalized groups are honored as full partners. The call to take up the cross reminds us that life flourishes not through the domination of others, but through our sacrificial love. And the question that should be lingering in our minds from Mark is quite piercing. What is the value of gaining everything the world prizes if in the process we lose our very selves? What is the worth of securing dominance if our compassion is eroded? What is the benefit of proving our strength if our souls become captive to our fears? Genesis and Mark together invite a different imagination. an imagination in which women are not appendages to the promise, but we are bearers to it. An imagination in which power is redefined by love rather than control. An imagination in which security is found not in asserting our superiority over one another, but in trusting that God, who brings us life out of the barrenness and resurrection out of death. As disciples, we are called to set our minds beyond what seems immediately practical, what seems impressive to others. We are called to discern divine things in a world obsessed with human calculations of strength. And that discernment starts close to home. It asks how we structure our families and our churches, how we interact in our communities. Are we making room for everyone's voice? Do we honor the gifts of those who history has often sidelined? Do we challenge the assumptions that place them perpetually in front of others? And it extends outward. It asks how we imagine peace in this fractured world. Do we believe that it can be made through displays of force? Or are we willing to explore the costly and patient work of justice? The laughter in Genesis wasn't the last word. The resistance in Mark is not the end of the story. In both texts, God's love prevails. Sarah becomes the mother of nations, and the rejected Messiah becomes our risen Lord. Life emerges not from being in control, but from the trust they had in God. In a restless and anxious age, that may be the most radical message of all. May we have the courage to let God rename our assumptions. May we have humility to release our grip on our inherited patterns of power. And may we follow Christ along the way, even when it looks weak, and even when the world is leading us somewhere else, again and again. I want to share this evening a poem that I was handed 2 weeks ago by Cliff Bartley. It really touched my heart. I read it multiple times over the next few days, and I feel like it asks a lot of questions that we ask. It helps us to question our faith sometimes, because then we find that path of love that we're looking for. So, in Cliff's words, the poem is titled Heaven in My Heart. Lord, I hold heaven in my heart. O Lord, I hold heaven in my heart, in my heart. Still, my mind questions, questions, questions. That troubles my hopeful soul. Lord, understand that my viewpoint is limited, and still in me why cancer, strokes, and accidents happen to good people. Is evil lurking unseen? Lord, I hold heaven in my heart, in my heart. Lord, I hold Jesus in my heart. O Lord, I hold Jesus in my heart, in my heart. Still, my mind questions, questions, questions. That troubles my hopeful soul. Lord, yet unrevealed is your eternal plan. Enlighten me why deformities, disabilities, and dreaded diseases, innocent babies suffer. 'Tis it the sins of their parents. Lord, I hold Jesus in my heart, in my heart. Lord, I hold thou in my heart. O Lord, I hold thou in my heart, in my heart. My mind questions, 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 that troubles my hopeful soul. Lord, comprehend that my perspective is self-centered. Help me understand why dementia, deafness, and loneliness befalls the elderly in their greatest hours of need. Lord, I hold thou in my heart, in my heart. It's number 469. The wrong one's printed in the bulletin. He's playing the right song. If you open up your hymnal to 469, that is the song he is playing. Yes. 469. Holy Creator, Maker of all things, we give thanks to you for this world that you have entrusted us with. We give thanks for all of creation that we are made in your image. We ask that you come down and wrap your loving arms around all those that we mention by name each week, but all those also that we leave silently written on our hearts. May you bless them through us. May they feel your love through us. May we come beside those who are feeling overwhelmed with darkness in the seasons of their life and hold them up. And may we do so knowing that your Son has taught us how to love. Amen. Bless the Lord.
The Lord's name be praised.
Go in peace.